These hundreds of naked toddlers into the Senate chamber because the toddlers are our future. They're our babies. And they'd have to clean up the mess. So, you know, you have to think about how to attract the media. They're very vulnerable to starry things, sexy things. Yeah. Are you game, Trudy?
So then, Dr. Caldecott, do I have you on record that you will be our special guest at Widener University School of Law for our first ever Nudes Against Nukes mark?
Body still looks okay, yeah. I'll come. Trudy will too, because she just nodded.
You ask my husband.
And we learn in the law that silence is acceptance.
Trudy will hold hands.
Wonderful. If we could move to a slightly different topic, and that is that nuclear weapons have to be created. They don't just appear, obviously. So what do we do about the manufacturing countries and institutions who make these weapons and the constant one-upsmanship? How do we address that?
Do it, Trudy? Or will we talk?
I mean, I think the issue is the policymakers. People who make the weapons sell them on contract. If the contracts aren't there, they don't make the weapons. Yes, they lobby, but times change. I was just talking over dinner. It seems to me that the issue of trigger alert, for example, which doesn't speak exactly to the manufacturers, but the principle, I think, remains the same. I think there are times when issues are hard to sell and times when issues are easier. The Cold War is over. There are huge budgetary issues out there. The Pentagon is going to have to cut back, no matter what Republican candidates say, simply because of the times. There will be cuts. And so, therefore, it's an opportune time for those who want to make certain points, I think, to get them across, because some weapons systems will go. Hair trigger alert is not an issue, for example, that I would think Republicans or anyone could campaign on as a necessity for everyday lives. So, you know, if you're talking about how do you affect manufacturers, I think what you have to deal with is how do you affect the policy of those who sign the contracts with the manufacturers?
Well, further on that note, in regards to policy itself, what we see is that in 1996 the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was passed and negotiated. However, we have still yet to ratify it within the United States. So how can we as activists most affect some sort of change in the policy to make it so that these manufacturers cannot continue to proliferate?
I think you've got to look at etiology. Etiology means the cause of an illness. I'm now speaking as a physician. We couldn't cure polio till we found the polio virus. And when Jonas Salk and Sabine and what was his name? I can't remember. Discovered the polio virus, then we could develop a vaccine and none of us get paralysed now. It still happens in India and other places. So what's the etiology of the nuclear pathology infecting the planet? It's not the number of bombs, it's not the contracts, it's not the military-industrial complex, it's not greed. It's the reptilian midbrain. So therefore, we've got to look at what is the impulse to develop weapons, and I'm going to write a book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. And it's going to be quite profound. There's a lot of work done recently on hormone receptors in the brain, male and female, and the influence upon behaviour and physiology of the brain. And I won't go into that now. But I think that I would say that emotions are engendered in the midbrain in all of us, and then we use our left brain to rationalise what our emotions want us to do. And we sound terribly rational, But in fact, we're driven by our emotions, and not to admit that is crazy. And our right brain plays a role because that's where music is engendered, and poetry and intuition. And incidentally, women's right and left brains are more closely connected than males because our corpus callosum, which connects both, is bigger in women than men. And I'll get into that too later, not in this talk, but in my book. But I think that some males, their reptilian midbrain has a toxic reaction to testosterone. And I would include in those males Rumsfeld and Cheney and Richard Pearl, and Wolfowitz, I could go on. And I also, 1 in 25 people are sociopaths. They're brilliant, charming, highly intelligent, sexy, but they've got no moral conscience. Now, you see these sort of people rise to the top like cream at Harvard Medical School, probably in the media, certainly in politics. And the sort of kind of normal people don't have the impetus or drive to compete with these people. And the last thing I would say is that there are the two instincts in the male brain that are very closely interrelated, which release dopamine, which is a lovely feeling you get after orgasm, or if you take a morphine-like substance, that lovely feeling. The two instincts that release dopamine in the midbrain are sex and violence. And in the male brain, these are closely related. Therefore, you have to ask, why do they show porno films to guys who take off from aircraft carriers to kill people? Why do men rape women when they conquer a territory? Why are many women in the military now getting raped? How do they train men to become killers? I'm going to write this book because I think if we don't look at the etiology or cause, we will never cure it. Even if I write the book, and I know it's going to be provocative because people get very upset and some men get very petulant because they think I'm criticising them, and the women try and protect the men and all that sort of dynamic. Unless we're game to look at this, we're never going to fix it. I do believe we're capable of great moral, psychological growth. We stopped slavery, women have the vote, we've civilised ourselves, we're moving. But unless we stop killing, we'll go back to what Einstein said. The splitting of the atom changed everything, all reality, save man's mode of thinking. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe, and we still think we can kill. Why do we glorify war? Why is there a killer on every horse killer on a horse in every square in Europe? Why has Napoleon got a huge grave, mausoleum in Paris? He killed hundreds of thousands of people. I don't understand it, because I took the Hippocratic Oath and I've spent my whole life trying to save lives, children's lives, helped children like my wonderful colleague here to die. We've got to stop killing each other, and that's the underlying ethic, and unless we look at that, we will achieve nothing.
Oh. And we have a question for Trudy. And this dovetails off of the idea of the reptilian brain as well, if you would like, and that every animal sometimes tends to work in packs or in groups. So what are your opinions about the ascension of game theory equilibrium as the main factor when advising nuclear policy? And what is your response to the assertion that maintaining the status quo is the only truly safe and beneficial equilibrium?
I don't know who wrote that question. And I'm not sure whether he meant it as a trick or as a serious question, but I'm afraid I don't have a clue as how to answer it.
Well, it's just that the idea that...
That's a male question. That comes from the left brain, that question.
Which might
Not
be why
the right brain.
Which might be why I feel I might be able to clarify.
Translate it into clear English. I might give it a try.
Well, How about the idea that yes, there are several thousand nuclear weapons in the world, but many of them, 23,000 that we know of.
Yeah.
And most of those are held by Russia and the United States. Whereas we also see that the other countries like Pakistan and India and China and Israel, some of their nuclear weapons are considered much less secure. So is deterrence really the best policy to maintain an equilibrium of a balance of terror, as they say?
Deterrence has worked between the U.S. and Russia for a lot of reasons, although, as Helen says, there's always that one time where somebody trips or God knows what, which is why this hair trigger alert business is so insane. But during the Cold War, we all know that deterrence worked. With a country like China, which aspires to be a great power, I don't know if you'd say that deterrence works, but I think it's in the same league as the US and Russia, where what you might possibly worry if they acquired more weapons is some untoward accident, but they would not take nuclear weapons lightly. The question of whether deterrence works when you get to other kinds of players, I think, is much, much trickier. The country that worries me the most, frankly, is Pakistan. And there are psychological factors which might well lead to a situation where deterrence wouldn't work at all. Pakistan is obsessed with India. India is busily going about becoming an economic superpower and pays attention to Pakistan, but is not obsessed in the same way. And should another major terrorist episode happen in India, as happened in Mumbai, where the terrorists clearly come from Pakistan, and whether or not Pakistan denies it or admits it, have some intelligence connections with Pakistani intelligence. And should India then try to respond in a non-nuclear fashion, but moving regular troops across the border into Pakistan, I think there is a chance that Pakistan would use nuclear weapons first because of their fear of being dismembered, and B, Pakistan is developing tactical nuclear weapons to use on the battle, and since they have so many troops on the border with India, you might have a mid-level commander who would use a tactical nuclear weapon. So I think there's all these psychological issues involved with Pakistan and India that could well lead deterrence not to work, not to mention that the time frame is compressed because you have troops right on the border, and on the Pakistani side, they are, as I say, developing these tactical nuclear weapons which will be up close to the border. So you don't even have the few minutes that you would have if the US and Russia had actually ever launched. So it's the real question. I think that what you worry about most depends on what issues you're closest to, and as I was saying to some people, although the bulk of the weapons are held by the US and Russia, I tend to worry more about what's going on in South Asia, potentially with Iran, because I see actors that act in ways that are less susceptible to a rational calculation and more susceptible to local emotion.
So can I just go on from that? It's been the people who did the nuclear winter study, Crutzen, who got the Nobel Prize, and Alan Robock and others, studied an exchange between India and Pakistan where only 100 weapons were used. And that would lead to nuclear autumn, where it would be so cold and dark that billions would starve from starvation. And the other thing that, and I think it's very likely, too, that because Al-Qaeda could actually, many of the people in the Pakistani military belong to the Taliban. And Pakistan's dynamics are very fragile at the moment with the Prime Minister under threat and the like. So the Taliban could get control of their nuclear weapons, and they don't really see them as they don't understand what it means. So they could be used, but such a situation, as I pointed out previously, if there is an exchange between India and Pakistan, which I think is on the cards, that in the anxiety and absolute turmoil that would arise, and because of the hair trigger alert where things are set to go, if something like that should arise, could trigger an exchange between Russia and America, and then it's all over. So any aberration, nuclear aberration in the world, which worries me so much with lateral proliferation, could trigger the situation that's set up here. And I've studied this really deeply, and it's so fragile, the control that they have here and in Russia.
Well, as a follow-up, appropriate follow-up to this question, in regards to countries which are not as secure in their nuclear power and technology, what can we do to encourage and promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy while preventing the non-peaceful use? And is this still a good pledge to fulfill, as was authored in the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Not me.
I know you didn't. I can't believe someone would write that after Fukushima. The greatest industrial accident we've ever had, with 3 major meltdowns, with Tokyo radioactive, and I can give you all the references, with children already getting thyroid tumours within a year, and you don't expect that for at least 15 years, where after Chernobyl, according to the New York Academy of Sciences, up to now, 25 years hence, 1 million people have already died. And the accident at Fukushima is 2.5 to 3 times worse than Chernobyl. And the population is much more heavily populated in Japan than Chernobyl. So you multiply 1 million by 3. Who wrote that question? I mean, we've got to be in touch with reality. You live within 40 miles of several very dangerous nuclear power plants, one of which is 40 years old, and they want to extend its lifespan. It's like extending a lifespan of a woman aged 94 for another 20 years. Crazy. And as they get older, it's like old people. Our pipes get rusty. I've got an aortic plaque, you know. So they're aging, and they're vulnerable to accidents and meltdowns. What are you going to do if there's a meltdown 40 miles from here and the wind's blowing over Philadelphia? Have you worked that out? You can't evacuate. Where to? Do you know what acute radiation illness means? That if you're enveloped in a huge cloud of radiation like at Fukushima, but over Philadelphia, that you could develop within 2 weeks acute radiation illness with your hair falling out, vomiting and bleeding to death. Do you know that? Do you know that the NRC is funded by the nuclear industry? Do you know that you're not protected at all? Do you know that all nuclear reactors are bomb factories as we export them abroad? Do you know that nuclear waste lasts, according to the EPA, for 1 million years and there's no way to get rid of it? You've got 70,000 tonnes. Do you know that within 100 years the containers break, leak, and the material gets into the water and bioconcentrates by orders of magnitude in the food chain? Do you know that 40% of Europe now is currently radioactive and will be for thousands of years? Don't eat European food. Do you know it takes 5 to 60 years to develop cancer, the latent period of carcinogenesis? You must understand the dangers. This is far more serious than the Black Plague. And as we bequeath our nuclear waste, even without meltdowns, or even without a nuclear war, bequeath nuclear waste to future generations, people wake up in the morning, the baby's already been born deformed from teratogenesis like thalidomide did, with congenital disease, breast milk radioactive, and children getting cancer at the age of 6 and not 60 because they're exposed to radioactive food early. And children are 20 times more radiosensitive than adults, and little girls twice as sensitive as little boys. Fetuses thousands of times more so. So we will produce random compulsory genetic engineering for the rest of time from nuclear waste, from weapons production and from nuclear power. And we will see epidemics, I'll be dead and so will you, of cancer, leukemia and genetic disease, not just in humans, but animals get tumours too, and they all have genes, and so do plants. So we're destroying the very building blocks of life by filling the environment up with radioactive isotopes. I wrote about it in my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. I don't make money out of it, so don't worry, but read it to educate yourselves.
And we have a somewhat of a political question as well, and this is addressed to Ms. Rubin. Both Iran and Iraq have made clear in the appropriate negotiating arenas that they have no intentions of taking the mismanaged rhetoric of this proxy situation and go to war over the media's chosen hype around the world, and that the costs would far outweigh the benefits. So the question is why focus on, I'm doing my best, but it's tough to decipher some questions. How do we reduce the weapons possessed by the largest actors in the nuclear world?
We've dropped Iran and Iraq.
It's tied into the same index card.
We started with Iran and Iraq. Okay, we moved to the largest actors. How do we do? I'll leave that to Helen. I mean, there's negotiations going on. There's START 2. We don't know where it's going to go, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously, we try to negotiate down, but whether there will be any progress between Obama and Mr. Putin, if Obama serves a second term, I don't know. If Obama doesn't serve a second term, probably, most likely not. If there are other ways, I leave that to you to...
Well, God help us if a Republican wins. God help us. I mean, Romney wants to build 15 more nuclear submarines, like the one I showed you. Romney does. He's big into ships and hardware. I mean, the guys, I mean, you have to start looking at this psychologically. And it really does depend upon the population of America. Like we rose up in the 80s, 80% rose up, and we helped to end the Cold War. All of us did, the older ones here. Now we've got to do it again, and I know we're tired and older, but there are young ones coming in our stead. It's up to us. It's not up to Obama, it's up to the American people. And it's up to educating. And they do have to be educated through the media. I mean, when I was on Good Morning America with Brian Gumbel, and I'd get 3 minutes, he'd ask me a question. If it was not relevant, I'd turn to the camera knowing I had 60 million people there, and I'd talk to the people. And that's the way you educate Mr. and Mrs. Joe Sixpack, because they're all sitting there watching the television. I've got a film with me called, well, it's my film called If You Love This Planet, that won an Oscar. I gave a speech in Plattsburgh, New York in '82, next to a SAC air base. And the National Film Board of Canada filmed it and turned it into a film, which I hated, but it got an Oscar. So the Justice Department here has banned it as foreign propaganda. It's never been played here. It's half an hour long. So I suggest that you get up. I'm showing it in colleges now and doing that to the Justice Department. And if they sue me, I'll get on Rush Limbaugh, and I'll get on Fox, and I'll get on, you know, if you make it sort of sex up the issue, as Tony Blair said, you'll get all over television. So I'm hoping the Justice Department sues me and I end up either in jail when I lose my green card, or I'll get on television. That's the way to do it. It's a very potent film, and I showed it to students and it just blows them away. The haircuts are different, but the medical implications of nuclear war and the Hiroshima victims are the same. And I could give you that lecture right now. So I suggest you get that film and you play it all over the place, and it breaks through people's psychic numbing and gets to their souls, as we do with our patients when we have to tell them they've got a disease. It's called If You Love This Planet. If you go to my webpage, HelenCaldicott.com, you'll find it there. I've got it over there, but you can write to the film board and get it. And just play it everywhere and it actually went to the Supreme Court because there's a 1948 law banning communist propaganda or something. So they banned it. It's only a medical talk. And 2 films on acid rain made by Canada. So it went to the Supreme Court. So the maker made another film called If You Love Free Speech. So go for it.
And I see that we are unfortunately just about out of time and are unable to address all of the index card questions that were presented. And we also see that Dr. Caldecott has beat us to the punch in asking for brief closing remarks as well. You've addressed many important issues, and the film was something that, you spoke to the students earlier, was something that I feel is a great way to end on as well, because that is a very touching film which could educate and inspire many people and students alike out in the world. And we would like to ask Ms. Rubin if she had any closing remarks as well.
Only that the one thing that I would most like to say in closing is that I'm honored to be sitting here not only with Helen, but looking straight at Craig. Yes. And just want to thank him for everything that he has done and written, and being such a good friend to all of us besides.